Hi, everybody. This is Tony Nash with Complete Intelligence. Thanks again for joining us for another quick hit. We've got a special opportunity today for an extended discussion with two really important people. We've got Albert Marco and we've got Christopher Balding. I'm glad we get to host this cage match between Albert and Christopher today. I'm hoping it's a lot of fun. Can each of you guys, before we get started, can you just give us, 20 seconds on who you are and what you do for the kind of three or four people who may not know you?
Albert, you want?
Yeah, I'll go. I'm a political economic consultant. I basically help a couple financial firms, members of Congress, a couple governments to manage and navigate their way through the Beltway and the legislative issues and the politics and how the Federal Reserve and all the economic policies filter down.
Great.
And so I'm basically a China and a data nerd at this point. I spend most of my time, unfortunately, these days on the phone talking to people about the data that we found and all that kind of good stuff, because there is just it's amazing how little is known about China even to this day. So data and real information is at such a premium.
Very good. Thanks, guys. I know you're both busy. I really appreciate you taking the time for this. We've got a bunch of questions off of Twitter, and the first one is from Axe Rendale, at Axe Rendale. They say, if you were in charge of U.S. foreign policy, what are the top things you would change from the status quo? They asked about 5 things. I don't think we have that much time. So what are a couple things, let's say 2 things in terms of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, that you would change? Of course, we have the election coming up, but regardless of the individual status quo, we've seen some status quo upheaval over the past few years. But what would you really change? Not just the top line, but the way the U.S. acts. Albert, why don't you go first?
I would immediately start looking at South America and Africa in the way and identifying and eliminating, or at least hampering, Chinese and Russian interests there. I mean, specifically Venezuela would be my number one choice right now. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians, they have a field day there. There's almost no U.S. intervention in there, and the same goes for parts of Africa. I know that we have troops in Mali and Niger and a couple places to deal with terrorism, but just solidifying some of the countries out there, like Morocco, Angola, and preventing the Chinese from making inroads, I would make that a priority.
Great. Okay, Dr. Balding.
So I would agree with Albert in general terms, but maybe take it in a slightly different direction. I think the Trump administration has done a good job, shifting the focus to, the larger problems and China, and taking, those policy steps that are well within their grasp. I think what needs to be, the next step, and whether this is under a Trump administration or a Biden administration, is the reality is that you can't handle these issues on the cheap. And the Germans and Asian countries are not just going to be persuaded by, the moral rightness of confronting China. So, just to give you 2 examples of where you might see something. If the U.S. was to offer even to European countries to fund 5G rollout at zero interest loans, because what China's doing is the way they run the finances is basically giving away 5G gear. So if the U.S. made zero interest loans, really you could fund that if it was in some type of a levered development finance corporation structure, where with a couple $1 billion a year, honestly, globally. Right. You could do that entire project globally, and on the U.S. budget, a couple $1 billion a year is almost couch cushion money.
Right, and this is similar to how Japan is competing with China for infrastructure in parts of Asia, right? They're giving no interest or extremely 0.3% interest loans for infrastructure, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, like in Vietnam, where I can speak a little bit more authoritatively, they are, they don't want to they're not fans of China. At the same time, they recognize they have to work with China, so it's a very pragmatic approach. At the same time, they're like, we want to give the French certain certain pieces of the pie. We want to give the Americans, and so Vietnam is actively trying to balance, where their economic investment comes from, so that they don't become too dependent on any one source.
Yep, it's smart. It's smart.
Yeah, the only issue I have with that is that you're absolutely correct, and that's exactly what should be done. But is depending on the European partners to even come and play ball, because within the European Union themselves, there's competing interests on all sides, and it's difficult for the United States to try to compete with the Chinese, who give 99-year loans for infrastructure in Africa, to dictate which European nation gets a slice of the pie when they're all conflicting with themselves to begin with. So that's the only thing I'd have to say about that. But
so let me ask you this. Right. That's an interesting point. So China is very successful in terms of foreign policy by peeling off one member of a bloc at a time. And there's no better example than the way they peeled off Cambodia from ASEAN in order to break kind of the voting bloc that's necessary to get anything through there. They've done the same with the EU, with, say, Portugal or Greece or something like that, right? Do you see the US being able to do that, go and interrupt a bloc by getting, say, a single or a couple of allies there? Because I haven't seen the US do that all that successfully, say, for 20 years. Do you think we can do that successfully again?
Well, I think that we absolutely can be that successful if we actually had the will to do it. The problem is the Chinese are just literally filling in the gaps, the vacuums that the United States have left. And this is something that the United States just needs to get over the dirty word of intervention and just get on with business and solidify, U.S. interests abroad.
So I would actually slightly differ from Albert on this, and I see it in a very structural way. If you take the EU to basically to move against Chinese interests in Europe, there's an asymmetry here. The U.S. has to get everybody to agree. China only has to get one to disagree. Okay.
Why does the U.S. have to get everyone to agree?
Because basically, if the EU, for instance, is going to pass a regulation blocking Huawei gear, it's a unanimous vote. Okay, that's the only way it gets through the EU is through a unanimous vote. So the U.S. has to get everybody to agree. China only has to get one to disagree. If you look at like the UN with the UN Human Rights Council, we can talk about the U.S. should do this or that with the Human Rights Council. The reality is that China, till the end of time, is going to have enough votes to put Russia, Venezuela, Libya, etc., on the Human Rights Council because of the number of countries that there are and the number of countries that they can get to agree with them. So people talk about, well, it's a Trump issue. No, that's the reality. That's the systemic nature of the international system.
Right.
Yeah, okay. And one of the things that the United States has absolutely not done is use the United States dollar as a weapon to combat that. But that's a whole different topic, and we can get all sidetracked on that one. But
yeah, we can spend a lot of time on that. Here's a question from Srikanth. The Twitter handle is Ramani Srikanth. How much is how much is China policy hinged on who wins the U.S. election? Do you believe that fundamentally the Democrats and Republicans would have fundamentally different China policies? Dr. Balding.
So let's put it this way. I would be, especially after the Russian debacle that they had in the Obama administration and the people that came out of that, I would be surprised if they did like a complete reset. Okay, where they went in the complete opposite direction and had a big reset ceremony, etc. That said, the first thing I would say is that I don't think Democrats really have any real agreement about what they want to do with China. Okay. Even within people within the Biden administration, or what would supposedly be a Biden administration, you have people that honestly I think would be, if they weren't Democrats, would probably fit well within a Trump administration. And you have people that would practically be German in their approach, in that there's no concession they wouldn't like. So you've heard things about, well, they want to focus on climate change, and this 2060 promise is, hey, great, we have something to go with here. I don't think anybody really has a good idea. My own personal suspicion would be, more than anything, the Trump administration has actually been very deliberate in continuing, generally speaking, across policy domains, and continuing to turn up the pressure slowly, like a pressure cooker. I don't think you would see that under a Biden administration. I don't think necessarily you would see a rollback of most Trump policies.
Okay, so the new status quo is probably the new status quo if there's a Biden administration. Okay, yeah. Albert, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with Chris wholeheartedly. Xi is at a do or die moment with Trump being reelected. If Trump is reelected and the pressure is maintained or even raised, I do not think he lasts 2 or 3 years in there. Okay. As for a Biden presidency and what it would look like, I mean, all we have to do is go back to the track record of the Obama Biden presidency and see what they've done. I mean, it's been complete. Just ignore whatever China does and let them run around the world and do whatever they want. We sat there for 2 years in 2013 watching China militarize islands while there was absolutely no response. I mean, having Samantha Power back in, McFaul, Valerie Jarrett, Susan Rice doesn't give me any confidence whatsoever into dealing with the Chinese.
I was in Asia during that time, jumping up and down, and told that I was overly aggressive. So I share your frustration. So okay, here's a question from at James Roberta 7. What does a Xi Jinping CCP China situation look like if Trump is elected and Pompeo stays at state? So Albert, you mentioned that, very briefly in your response. Can you tease that out just a little bit? What does that look like the first, say, 24 months of that type of situation?
Europeans, the US, Mexico, which is
well, it really depends on the actions of the Trump administration. Do they ramp up tariffs again? Do they start pressure them in China? Do they pressure them in Vietnam, the Philippines? I think they do. The Chinese are going to have to respond to safeguard their own interests. What do? Maybe cause a skirmish with the Indians again, threaten the Taiwanese a little bit more. I mean, they can't really act militarily. They don't have the capacity to do that, and they'd be completely embarrassed, and that's a whole different argument unto itself. But like I said, the days are numbered if Trump is reelected for Xi. I don't think the elite families within the Guangdong province would put up with further losses of their wealth.
Yeah, I think that's something that's lost on a lot of the American analysts. There is not a monolithic kind of Chinese Communist Party. There are factions within the CCP. There are different power centers, and a lot of even the think tankers in America act as if there is this, this single head at the head of the CCP who's, making sure all. And he tried that in 2015, and he has definitely solidified some power, but there are still some very powerful factions. Chris, what do you think about that? If there's a kind of a Trump-Pompeo, that partnership continues, what do you think that looks like for China and the CCP?
So I'm going to slightly diverge slightly from Albert here, in that what we've basically seen, I think, in the first 4 years of Trump, especially in the past, let's say 2 years, is that Trump is taking a lot of things that are well within the executive purview that he can do. Whether that's, sanctions of different kinds, things like that. Although, in a way, the amount of pain that he can cause China within that basket of tools is at this point it's increasingly limited. Okay, in different ways. Probably the biggest thing that he could do is do something that really blocked like IPO or really crimped dollar access. Okay. Mm-hmm. Crimped dollar access, I think, is an enormous. I mean, that's an enormous weapon. But I think the next step, and I think you're actually seeing a lot of groundwork being laid. Is and you just saw, for instance, some comments out of India where the U.S. Where the State Department is talking about really ramping up its alliance with India, and you're starting to see a lot of these very foundational type of stuff. So whether it's increased congressional spending to military things, alliances, different stuff like that, I think that would be likely where you would see a lot of the focus, especially legislatively, to get authorization to do those types of activities.
Okay, that's a great point as you bring up India to ask this question. Dog the Cynic, at Dog the Cynic on Twitter asks, how durable do you think the Sino-Russian alliance is? And I bring that up because India and Russia traditionally have had a strong alliance post-war. And so if the US and India continue to get closer, at some point, will Russia have to choose between China and India as an ally? Is that even a choice? Do they even think about that anymore? So I guess let's start with, how strong is that China-Russia alliance? Is it just a resources for weapons type of alliance, or is it really a tighter alliance for that?
Well, if you look at it historically, it's nothing more than a cyclical, friends with benefits, if you want to call it,
right.
If you want to call it that. It comes and goes. Their interests are aligned in one area. They conflict on another. Right now, they're conflicting in Africa quite a lot, more than people understand. The Indians they've used Russia as a counterbalance to the Chinese for decades. I mean, it's quite clear. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians don't trust each other. They never will. The Chinese have been encroaching on their borders. So, I mean, is it strong? No. Is it, can an India-U.S. alliance possibly tip it more in their favor? I really don't think so. I don't think the Indians are ignorant to the fact that they need Russia as a counterbalance just as much as they need the United States security blanket.
Right.
So the way I would phrase it is that that there is what is the honor among thieves, okay? And they clearly are frenemies. The
Sure.
Russians know that China is stealing plane designs and engine designs and all this kind of good stuff. At the same time, Huawei is working with Russia to hire local hackers and setting up things in Russia to engage in cyber warfare and whatnot, because they have a very common enemy. And so as long as there's a common enemy for them to focus on, and it benefits them to fight that common enemy, I think absolutely that partnership is at least to a plausible degree is going to exist for the sake of the kids, for lack of a better term.
Okay,
well said.
Okay, I've got some very similar questions from @GabrielFox1, @JSchwartz91, and @AmericaCapital1 about Taiwan. So, China-Taiwan, U.S., pretty delicate relationships. And a lot of the questions are really about kind of kinetic conflict, but also the business aspect of China-Taiwan relations, and increasingly Taiwan-U.S. relations with some of the semiconductor activity that the U.S. has undertaken against China. So can you kind of open that up a little bit for us? First of all, do you think a China-Taiwan conflict in the next, say, 24 months is more than, say, 30% possible, which is just a hedge, right? I mean, is it realistically possible? that's kind of a yes or no. But do you think there will be more difficult commercial relationships between China and Taiwan, or do you think this is just something that is kind of window dressing and they need each other?
Do I think there's a conflict brewing? Absolutely. In the next 24 months? Absolutely not. I don't think the Chinese have the capabilities. I don't think they want to be embarrassed. Furthermore, the Chinese elite, they have money wrapped up in Taiwan. They're not going to sit there and cut off their money supply just because Xi wants to prove a point that,
Right.
like I said, I don't believe they can win a war quickly. It would hurt.
So I will actually kind of disagree with Albert here. My understanding of the military capabilities actually align with Albert, and what I've, the people I trust have basically said, it's really going to be 2022, 2023 before they probably have, the capabilities necessary. But
That's 2 years from now.
yeah, that would be on the outer edge of your 24-month type of time frame. But Albert said something very interesting, which I think it bears worth repeating, is they don't want to be embarrassed. Well, let's look at how China's behaved in the past, year or so. Okay, I don't think you can project that level of rationality on Xi Jinping. I mean, why the hell are they fighting over some frozen tundra in the Himalayas?
Right.
A couple of square kilometers. Logically, it makes zero sense.
Right.
I should also say, I'm not saying that there's going to be a war. It could be some type of low-level conflict. There's a lot of different ways that it could be. So this doesn't necessarily mean full-scale invasion. But I would definitely put, some type of event, conflict, distinctly higher.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's unlikely, but given my exposure to mid-levels of Chinese ministries, they are not the rational, kind of thoughtful, wise organizations that many Americans think. And Xi Jinping, as you say, Chris, why are you fighting over some icy hills in northern India? It's just stupid, right? So I don't believe the Chinese government is as thoughtful as wise as many Westerners suspect. They make stupid mistakes like everyone else. I'm not saying they're more stupid than anyone else. I think they're they're human beings. So, okay, good. Now let's move along a little bit more into economics, I guess, and talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is something that I actually worked on for about 1.5 years. So, there's been some talk, I guess, in particular the last few months about the Anglosphere, and will the West have an answer to the BRI? And this is really a 8-year-old question, I guess, but I guess my first question is, does the U.S. need a response to the BRI as a government initiative? And if so, do you think they can do it?